Okay, so now we are going to talk a little bit about when the traditional theories fail. So we can see that there are basically other reasons different than technology, accumulation of physical and human capital, which may explain difference across countries' income. This states that previously studied models are at some point incomplete as they are not understanding the actual driving forces of long-term economic growth. These different reasons will be referred to as fundamental causes of economic growth. These fundamental causes of economic growth can be classified as follows: the log hypothesis, the geography hypothesis, the culture hypothesis, and the institutions hypothesis. So moving on to log hypothesis, log is basically referred to as a set of fundamental causes which can explain different paths of economic performance because or due to some sort of uncertainty in economy. So we have a game which can illustrate this coordination failure issue. Then in this game there are two clear pure strategy equilibrium. One equilibrium, the individual expects other agents to choose high investment as he does, then all other agents will choose high investment and establishes high investment equilibrium. In accordance, when the individual expects other to choose low investment, his best response is to choose low investment as well, which will lead to a low investment equilibrium. Then we have multiple equilibria here, one which is more beneficial than the other, which will be high investment and high investment. Then moving on to the geography hypothesis, geography is basically referred to a set of factors that are forced on individuals as part of their own environment, which can be explained through several mechanisms. Here we have the three main. The first one is that climate can affect productivity, as people on hot climate can be lazier than those who are living in a colder climate. Then we have another one which states that climate has an impact on soil and vegetation, which then may and will shape whether societies are able to develop complex organizations or advanced technologies. And finally, poverty in some areas of the world is linked to their disease burden. So the burden of infectious disease is higher in the tropics than in temperate zones. So this prevalence of diseases alone reduces economic growth in the long term. There are also several critics of this theory, as unfavorable geography may accelerate investment in technology and industries and achieve it before others, which suggests that economies with favorable geographic conditions may be caught up in the long term due to their lack of investment in advanced technologies and industries.
The next fundamental is culture. As we know, there are many different cultures across countries, races, and ethnic groups around the world that differ in values, preferences, and beliefs of individuals, as well as societies, due to shared experiences and religions. These determine how people behave, for example, being more productive or leisure-oriented. So if an economy is all about individualism and work, it comes to more innovation and therefore growth. Societies may become dysfunctional, though, because their cultural values and their system of beliefs do not encourage cooperation. The problem is also that culture is difficult to measure. It's a complement to institutional factors. The last one is institutions. Nov defined institutions the following. Institutions are the rules of the game in a society, or more formally, are the humanly devised constraints that shape human interaction. This could be things such as the structure of markets, the set of feasible contracts and transactions, allocations of endowment, and ownership rights to individuals. There are three elements to institutions. They are humanly devised, which means the society decided themselves. It is in their control, unlike, for example, geography. The second is institutions place constraints on individual behavior. That means there's a punishment or rewarding for certain actions, such as going to jail when murdering someone. And finally, this leads to that institutions shape human interaction and influence incentives, affecting behavior made by the constraints, since, as we know, individuals respond to incentives. It is important to encourage the people to innovate, do new things, and so on in order to possibly grow. And this encouragement of physical and human capital accumulation and the invention and adaptation of new technologies is what makes a good economic institution. You should consider, though, that this creates winners but also losers, which are compensated by the winners. So let's talk about the effect of institutions on economic growth. On the right side, you can see the cross-country correlation between GDP per capita and average protection against the expropriation risk. But it doesn't necessarily reflect causal relationship, because it might be the other way around. Which countries can afford property rights, or other factors than institutions explain why countries are rich and why they have property rights. But how can we prove whether there is a causal relationship? There are two options. The first one is estimating structural economic models, but there's a lack of knowledge about evolution of economic institutions and their impact on economic outcomes. The second one is using more reduced approaches based on instrumental variable strategies. One approach is taking natural experiments, which are historical events during which institutions, while other fundamental causes of economic growth are held constant, change because of potential exogenous reasons. In the following, we will take a look at two of those natural experiments.
The first natural experiment that we will have a look on is the Korean experiment. As you all know, Korea is split into North and South Korea, but what are the main differences? In North Korea, we have communism, so there are no private property rights in land and capital. In South Korea, there are private property rights. And also in North Korea, the economic decisions were not led by the market, but by the communist state. And in South Korea, there are capitalist economic institutions. And as a consequence, we have a stagnation in North Korea, and we experience economic growth in South Korea. And what is also important to know is before the split of North and South Korea, they shared one history, one culture, and there were only few geographic distinctions. And they also have the same disease environment, and they had approximately the same income per capita. And therefore, we can assume a causal influence of the institutions on prosperity, and the different institutions led to different economic outcomes. But this is only one case and an example of an extreme case. And therefore we will look at a further natural experiment. And the next one is the colonial experiments, and what you can see on this slide is before 1500 or in 1500 societies which were among the richest, such as the Aztecs or the Incas, are now among the poorer nations. In contrast, less developed societies, as they were in North America, New Zealand or Australia, are now among the richest countries. And the richest countries were mostly in tropical areas, and now the countries in tropical areas are among the poorer countries. And this is called reversal of fortune. And around 1500, also important to know, the European colonialists imposed different sets of institutions to various places. And how do we know which countries were rich about 500 years ago? Therefore, we take the urbanization rate or the population density, and the result was that the higher the initial population density or urbanization, the worse were the new institutions set by the Europeans in 1500 and today. Okay, so now we come to the background or to the reason why they created different institutions in different regions. In the non-tropical, non-urbanized and sparely settled areas, the Europeans created sets of institutions which protected property rights, as they became the majority of the population in those areas. And in the urbanized and tropical areas with high population density, the Europeans' interest was mainly to facilitate the extraction of resources. And there also was a disease environment, for example, malaria and yellow fever, which affected the European mortality. Okay, now coming to conclusion, the potential settler mortality, which was where the mortality rates expected by the first European settlers in the colonies affected the settlements, so where they settled and with how many people. And this affected the early institutions which the Europeans created. And these institutions still affect the current institutions and also the current performance. And finally, you can see a strong relationship between the historical mortality risk for European settlers and the current extent to which property rights are enforced. and that you can see in this graph here.
To talk about the institutional theory in a more deeply way, we have to talk about two types of main institutions. The first one is the contracting institutions, which regulate horizontal relationship between regular citizens and companies and between them. And the second one is the right property institutions, which regulate the vertical relationship between people and the elites, the politicians, the government, and privileged groups. The evidence has shown that the countries with more constraints on these elite people and the government and politicians has shown a higher level of growth rates, of economic growth rates, and higher levels of current income. Countries, for example, that have a higher level of these institutions are Sweden or Norway. And countries with higher level of contracting institutions are Colombia and Brazil. This doesn't mean contracting institutions are not important. These institutions are important in the way that they regulate financial intermediation, and it helps people to relate between pairs. In the institutional theory, we have to talk about the disease and development. There's evidence like Wales paper that show that health is an important factor in the productivity function. It has shown that it has important consequences of productivity in people. Nonetheless, disease is understood as endogenous. Today's unhealthy nations are unhealthy because they are poor and they are unable to invest in healthcare, as well as clean water and other technological improvements of health. To understand this, we have to look at the history look since 1940, where countries like the USA, Germany, and Japan started to grow, to experience high economic growth. The health development and improvement growth as well, and this development also arrives to medium-income countries and poor countries, as we see in the two graphs. The per capita GDP growth and the life expectancy at birth also growth. But if health is so important, why does health don't have several improvements in GDP per capita? To understand this, we have to take the neoclassical approach. So in first order, the effect of the increased life expectancy, increased population, which initially reduced capital labor and labor radius, depressing income per capita. After that, this initial decline is later compensated by higher outputs as more people enter to the labor force. This shows that small beneficial effects of health on productivity might not be sufficient to offset or reverse the negative effects of population pressure on income per capita over as long as 50 years more. So, to understand why some countries choose the good institutions to grow and why other countries choose the bad institutions, we have to look at the political economy. This leads us to understand that bad decisions are not taken by individuals looking at bad environment, but because collective choices. These don't ever look for the collective and the society welfare, but are very related to conflict of interest, manipulation, and corruption.